Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with Falcon Kayak, and welcome to the third video in our free Greenland paddle building series. In this video, we're going to talk about the advantages and the disadvantages of some different Greenland paddle shaping concepts. Now remember, this is a series, so if you haven't done this already, make sure that you go back and at least watch the introduction video. I'll throw a link up on the screen for that right now, and you can find the entire playlist with all these videos in order here on the channel. You can also find this entire series for free without any commercials on my website. And then, as always, if you want to support the free content that we put out here, think about picking up a set of our paddle plans, checking out our skin-on-frame boat building courses, buying your next piece of paddling gear from us, or just making a donation. You can find all that stuff on our website, and there are links in the video description below. And of course, if you have any thoughts or any questions, make sure you leave them in the comments. All right, enjoy the video. So in this video, we're going to take a really deep dive into Greenland paddle shaping. I'm going to talk about the shapes that I've used in the past, the ones that I'm using presently, and also I'm going to show you a really nice commercially produced carbon fiber Greenland paddle, and I'm going to talk about what I like and what I don't like about each of these different shaping concepts. Now, if you're looking for a general overview of Greenland paddles or sizing information, you're going to find that in the previous video in this series. So if you haven't watched that, go back and check that out because it's going to give you a lot more context before we talk about blade shapes in particular. So I've gone ahead and set my personal paddles on the workbench here. This one is an older design. It's a shouldered paddled with a dihedral blade. This one is a newer design. It's also a shouldered paddled, but it has an elliptical blade. And this one out here is a commercially produced carbon fiber Greenland paddle. This is the Kayak paddle from Gear Lab. And this is a shoulderless paddle with a very flat blade, and it's a little bit wider at the tips. So starting out with the Kayak paddle, I'm actually really surprised to be showing you this at all because for most of my paddling career, I would have told you that there are no good carbon fiber Greenland paddles, and it might not even be possible to build one because up until that point, everyone was just taking shaping concepts from wooden paddles and using them on carbon fiber, which doesn't work because it makes the paddles way too buoyant and way too stiff. So I wasn't expecting anything special when somebody handed me one of these on a paddle trip, but the minute I got this in my hands, I could tell it was totally different than what anyone else had done before in carbon fiber. It's super light, it has good power, good control, and the main thing that makes this paddle different than any other carbon fiber Greenland paddle in the past is that it flexes. And the flex in a Greenland paddle is the #1 thing that makes the difference between a paddle that feels okay and one that actually feels really nice to use. Now, I also like this because it's got nice fine edges here, which is going to make it more efficient. The tips are replaceable, so if you damage the end of the paddle, you can just put new tips on, and new tips come with the paddle when you buy it. It's also a two-piece paddle, which is nice for storage and travel, or if you want to store your break-apart paddle in 2 pieces on your front deck. Although for me personally, I always use a fully assembled Greenland paddle as my spare paddle because it's a lot easier to roll up with that if you lose your main paddle. Another thing that's great about this is that because it's carbon fiber, it's nice and light at 1 pound, 8 ounces. Now, the last thing I really like about this paddle is because it's so thin, it carries the effective foil section all the way up to the hand grip location, and that gives you lift all the way along this blade, much in the same way that you can do with a well-shaped shouldered paddle, and is usually not possible in an unshouldered paddle with a little bit thicker dimension. And the reason that matters is because when you're doing extended strokes, whether it's sculling or rolling, having your whole blade generate lift is obviously going to give you more power. So those are all the things I really like about this paddle. Now, getting into some of the things that I don't like about it, my personal preference is a shouldered paddle because I prefer the feel of the hand grip and I also prefer the indexing. And the hand grip on this just isn't quite as comfortable as my own paddle shapes, although it's not that bad either. And I would much prefer that this paddle stick with this shaping than be a little bit thicker, a little bit more comfortable, and lose its ability to flex. Now, another consequence of making this be able to flex is that these blades are actually quite thin. And for the most part, this is a good thing because a nice thin blade with sharp edges is going to be really efficient, it's going to be really powerful. The only potential downside of this is that when you get into the most extremely hard Greenland rolls, a blade with a little bit more camber than this is going to be a little more forgiving because it's going to be less sensitive to stalling at different blade angles. But that's something that no one but the very best Greenland rollers are even going to notice. Definitely not for most of the standard Greenland rolls. Now, my final complaint about this paddle isn't really something that's wrong with it. It's just a matter of personal preference. Personally, I prefer a paddle that's 3¼ inches wide at the tip, and this is 3½. So there's lots of things to like about this paddle, a couple things not to like about it, but generally speaking, I was so impressed with this when I tried it that I went out and bought myself one that afternoon. I took it out for another paddle the next morning just to make sure I had the same impression, and then that night I was on the phone with the company to see if we could become a dealership. So as of right now, Cape Falcon Kayak is a dealer for Gear Lab paddles. So if you're in the market for one of these, this is a great way to support all the free content that we put out. And also, we donate 10% of the profits from these to native kayak builders. So that's the Gear Lab paddle. Now let's grab one of my own wooden paddles here and talk about the differences. So first difference with this paddle is that it's a little bit longer and it's a little bit narrower. Like I just said, I really like this to be about 3¼ inches wide at the tip. Also, this is a shouldered paddle as opposed to the unshouldered paddle. I'm actually kind of obsessed with the shaping of the paddle in this area, so I want to talk about how I set this up. So for starters, I prefer a hand grip that is square with radiused corners as opposed to an oval. Because if you look at your hand, your grip isn't actually an oval or a circle, it's a little bit square shaped because of the flat spot on top of your thumb and underneath your forefinger. So this type of a shape doesn't make the paddle any less comfortable, but it does let me put extra wood in this area, which makes it a lot stronger and less likely to break. Now, on the blade here, you can't really see it from this angle, but I also like to take out a significant amount of material here and here so I can carve this blade into kind of a soft dihedral shape, which really helps with the comfort of the hand grip, but it also reduces a significant amount of wood, letting me make the paddle about 2 to 4 ounces lighter. Now, additionally, I like to carry the ridge of the blade all the way down to the root right here, because just like we talked about when we were talking about the Kayak paddle, if you can make the entire blade section a foil surface, that's just going to give you more power for your rolling and your sculling strokes. And then when all this comes together with your hand, your thumb and forefinger are going to wrap around the loom like this, and these 3 fingers are going to index over the blade. And that's going to give you a grip that is super positive, but at the same time is really, really light in your hand, so your forearm doesn't tense up and you don't get any kind of repetitive stress issues. Now, additionally, having these 3 fingers index over the blade as opposed to just being kind of mushy right here holds the blade at the exact right angle for your canted stroke, which is going to make your paddle more powerful. And then coming back out to the blade, like I said earlier, I prefer a paddle with a little bit more camber in it because it makes it less likely to stall if you're a little bit off angle. And to be perfectly honest, even more camber than this would make this an even better rolling tool, but that would come at the expense of the paddling performance because the blade would be way too stiff and it would be a lot heavier. So it's all about finding a balance between those different factors, and I go into a ton of detail about this in the paddle building course and also the paddle plans. We have a really extensive discussion about tuning the blade flex, and in the paddle plans during the final shaping steps, I have traced sections every 8 inches so you can duplicate this shaping exactly. So last thing I want to talk about on this paddle is the tip shape. Basically, a rounded tip is less likely to get damaged, but a square tip is going to be more efficient. So I basically just split the difference and make a half moon shape like this. Now, you'll notice that this paddle actually has some hardwood ash edges on the outside here, which helps to protect these corners from getting damaged, because these are the places that Greenland paddles tend to take the most abuse. Although it does come with the downside that it's a little bit harder to make it this way. It makes the blade a little bit stiffer than I like, but not a lot, and it adds a little bit more weight to the paddle. Now, just in case you're curious how this was done historically, you're looking at an illustration from Harvey Golden's book, Kayaks of Greenland, that shows whalebone or ivory edge protection and tip protection on a traditional Greenland paddle. And the reason for all this extra protection is because they weren't just using these to paddle with, they were also using them to break through ice and sometimes even to kill sea mammals. And if you wanted to, you could duplicate all these same details on a modern Greenland paddle, but the reason that I wouldn't do it is just because I can't make the tip as thin as I like and still have room to duplicate this joinery. Now, I have seen people do something similar with really hard hardwoods and modern adhesives and still be able to get the tips thin enough, but that's a pretty complicated woodworking project. So if that's something you want to do and you've got the skills for it, feel free to go for it. It's definitely going to make a tougher Greenland paddle at the end. But for me personally, I usually just put some hardwood edges on, and that gives me about 70% of the protection for significantly less work. Now, for the last paddle here, I was originally just going to show you one more shaping concept, but then I realized it might be more useful to show you this shape against its opposite shape. So what I've got here is a couple of my own Greenland paddles. These are both pretty old, so they're kind of beat up, and it's a little bit hard to see what's going on here. So why don't we come in a little bit closer and look at the shaping on this paddle right here. Basically what you're looking at here is a blade that's carved into a pretty sharp diamond shape that gets shallower and shallower as you get to the end of the paddle, but is still very well defined all the way down the blade. And the advantage of this shape is that unlike the other paddles on this table where they need to be paddled with a canted stroke to avoid blade flutter, this paddle can be pulled through the water vertical and it doesn't flutter up and down because the water splits over the ridge. Now, as far as paddling comfort, it's a really nice, comfortable way to paddle, and it's nice not to have to use the canted stroke. As far as efficiency goes, it definitely doesn't make this more efficient than either of these other paddles, and sometimes I think it might even be a little bit less, but I haven't done the empirical tests I would need to do to prove that. Now, another nice thing about this ridge up the middle here is that this removes as much wood as possible for the same amount of blade strength. And so what that means is that if you have two identical paddles, one with an elliptical shape and one with a diamond shape, the diamond one is going to be as light as it can possibly be for the same amount of strength, which can be really helpful if you have to carve your paddle out of a heavier species of wood. Now, getting into the downsides of the diamond-shaped paddle, the big one is that for your rolling and your sculling strokes, this type of blade is not going to be quite as efficient because the water tends to trip over this ridge right here when this is pulled through the water sideways, and you get a little bit more turbulence and you get a little bit less lift. Now, it's not a massive difference, and honestly, most of the rolls that you saw in this video were done with this paddle. But when you get into the very hardest Greenland rolls, or if you just want the best possible rolling performance, a paddle with a perfectly elliptical blade is definitely going to give you noticeably more power. Now, the final disadvantage to this diamond-shaped paddle is, like I said earlier, this is a harder shape to carve. It is surprisingly difficult to carve an accurate flat rolling bevel with just a block plane, which is why I do most of the shaping on this type of shape with a power plane, which is definitely faster, but it's also a little trickier because a power plane is a fairly aggressive tool and it's easy to screw up your paddle if you don't have good technique. So for people who are interested in carving the diamond shape, I usually recommend that they start by building a couple of elliptical paddles first, and then when they have good technique, they can tackle this more advanced shape. So I guess contrasting all three paddles on this table here, the diamond-shaped paddle is going to be lighter, more flexible, it's going to have a more beginner-friendly forward stroke. It is possibly a little bit less efficient on the forward stroke, although I can't prove that, and it is noticeably less efficient on rolling strokes. Now, this next one here is the opposite shaping. This is an elliptical shape all the way from the root of the blade down to the tip. This paddle is heavier, it's stiffer, it's not quite as nice to paddle with, although this is the most powerful rolling paddle of all the paddles on this table. And then finally here, we've got the shape that I have represented in the paddle plans, which is kind of a compromise between the two. It's got a nice thin elliptical shape out towards the tip, which slowly transitions into a soft diamond shape up by the root. So this paddle is nice and flexible. It's enjoyable to paddle with. It's a fairly powerful rolling paddle, although not as powerful as this one right here. And this diamond shape really fits into your hand nicely. Now, if you're curious about how much these different paddles weigh, this is not a very scientific comparison because these are different pieces of wood made at different times. But just to give you an example, this fully cambered paddle in the middle here is the heaviest at 2 pounds. This one out here, which is kind of a hybrid shape, is 1 pound 14 ounces. And this diamond shape is the lightest at 1 pound 12 ounces. Although keep in mind, all that is a moving target, just depending on the species of wood and also the size that you're building. So I think that's pretty much all I have to say about Greenland paddle shaping, at least as far as it relates to paddles that I would actually use. Now, I didn't get too much into the historic side of things in this video because even though there were some other paddle shapes that were used historically in Greenland, the examples that I've tried weren't very enjoyable to paddle with. So if you're interested in knowing more about some of the more exotic shapes of Greenland paddles, I would recommend checking out Harvey Golden's book, Kayaks of Greenland. It's got over 100 traditional Greenland kayak surveys, a whole bunch of paddles, and just a huge wealth of rich historic information about these native watercraft. All right, so I think that's it for now. Next video, we're gonna get into actually building these paddles.